3 days after we buried my grandmother, my brother walked into her kitchen while I was still in my pajamas, set a thick manila envelope on her kitchen table, and told me I had 48 hours to get out of her house. I was holding a mug of instant coffee I'd made from the same orange Folgers tin she'd kept above the stove for as long as I could remember. The mug had a faded cardinal on it, Ohio's state bird. She'd bought it at a gas station on a road trip we took together when I was 9 years old. I remember because she let me pick it out. My brother, I'll call him Bart because that's his name, and he doesn't deserve the dignity of a nickname, didn't even knock. He used the spare key my grandmother kept under the ceramic frog on the front porch. He walked in like he owned the place, which as of that morning he was claiming he did. He was wearing a pressed button-down and a blazer, which told me everything I needed to know. People don't dress that way at 8 in the morning to visit their grandmother's house unless they're making a statement. Behind him came his wife, Shelby. She had her hair blown out and her phone in her hand, already texting. She barely glanced at me. Her eyes went straight to the built-in bookshelves in the living room, then to the bay window overlooking the backyard, then to the original hardwood floors my grandmother had refinished herself a decade ago. I am 34 years old. I work as a forensic CPA in Cincinnati, which means I spend my professional life reconstructing fraudulent financial records and building the kind of paper trail that sends people to federal prison. I am trained to notice small details under pressure. I noticed that my sister-in-law wasn't grieving, she was appraising. My grandmother passed 6 days before this. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. She was 79 years old and had been in good health, which is why her cardiologist called it a sudden event. She had a routine blood pressure prescription she'd been on for 8 years without incident. 6 weeks before she died, she mentioned to me on the phone that her new pharmacy seemed to have switched her dosage. She said the pills looked slightly different. I told her to call her doctor. I didn't know then that I should have called the FBI. The envelope my brother put on the table contained what he called the updated will. He slid it toward me with 2 fingers, the way people push evidence across a table in movies. Grandma had this notarized 3 weeks before she passed, he said. His voice was careful, rehearsed. She was worried about the estate being tied up in probate. She made some changes. This supersedes the version her attorney has on file. I didn't touch the envelope. I looked at him over the rim of the cardinal mug. She never mentioned it to me, I said. She didn't mention everything to you, he said. My sister-in-law finally put her phone away. She crossed her arms and stood beside my brother like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact moment, which, as I would later discover, she basically had. The house transfers to Bart outright, she said. The commercial property goes into a family trust we've already set up. Your share is listed on page 4. You get $30,000 and her china cabinet. I looked at her for a long moment. She held eye contact with the practiced confidence of someone who believes the other person has no options. Here is what they didn't know about my grandmother. She was a woman who had survived the 1977 blizzard that shut Cincinnati down for 3 days, raised 2 children alone after my grandfather died, and built a modest but clean investment portfolio entirely on her own using library books. She did not make impulsive decisions. She did not change her will 3 weeks before dying without telling me. And she had stopped trusting my brother years ago. After he asked to borrow $40,000 for a real estate project in Columbus, she'd had a bad feeling. She told me at the time, very quietly, that she had said no, that money changes people you thought you knew. I set the mug down on the counter. I'll need time to have this reviewed by my own attorney, I said. That's your right, my brother said, in the tone of a man who doesn't believe you actually have rights. But property taxes are due in 60 days. If you're not cooperating with the transfer, we'll have to pursue a court order. There's a timeline, my sister-in-law added. The longer this drags out, the more it costs everyone. They left 40 minutes later. I stood at the bay window and watched their Range Rover back down the driveway. My sister-in-law didn't look back at the house. My brother did. The look on his face wasn't grief, it was calculation. I went to the basement. My grandmother had a root cellar under the basement stairs. She used it for canned tomatoes and mason jars of peach preserves, and apparently, secrets. I knew about the root cellar because I was the grandchild who spent real time here. Summers, holidays, occasional Tuesdays because I lived 20 minutes away, and she made good soup. I was the one who drove her to cardiology appointments. I was the one who helped her clean out the garage after my grandfather's truck finally gave up. And I was the one she called 3 months ago, on a Sunday evening, and told to remember that the cardinal doesn't have to be loud to be beautiful. That was what she said, word for word. She said it in the context of talking about my brother's increasingly aggressive attempts to get her to update her estate plan. She said it and then changed the subject, and I filed it away the way you do when something feels important, but you're not sure why. I moved the shelf in the root cellar, the one with the peach preserves. There was a floor panel behind it. Under the floor panel was a fireproof lockbox. The key was hanging on a small hook she drilled into the back of the shelf support, painted to match the wood. Inside the lockbox was a spiral notebook, a USB drive, a sealed envelope with my name on it, and a small business card. I sat down on the cool cement floor and opened my grandmother's letter first. She wrote the way she talked. No flourishes, no sentimentality. She said she had discovered over the past 2 years that my brother had forged her signature on a home equity line of credit application. He had borrowed $412,000 against this house. He had used it to fund a commercial development in Columbus that had since collapsed. The loan was still outstanding. The bank had been sending collection notices to a P.O. box he'd quietly opened in her name. She had intercepted one. She had started keeping records. She said she believed her medication had been tampered with. She had no proof yet, but she had written down every symptom and every conversation she'd had with the pharmacy, and a private investigator had been tracking records on her behalf. All of it was on the USB drive. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me sooner. She said she hadn't wanted to put me in danger. And then she told me to call the number on the business card. She said his name was Jerome. She said he was a retired IRS special agent who had lived next door for 30 years and had been her closest friend, and that he already knew everything, and that he would know exactly what to do. My mother had spent 3 decades treating Jerome like he was the hired help. She called him the neighbor, the way you'd say the plumber, a functional noun, not a person. Jerome was 68, black, and had spent 25 years tracking financial crimes for the federal government. He had been my grandmother's trusted friend and confidant. My mother had never known this because my mother had never bothered to ask. I called Jerome at 11 p.m. He picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call," he said. "Your grandmother told me the day would come. She hoped it wouldn't have to. Are they moving?" "They gave me 48 hours, I said. I heard him exhale slowly. "Then we have until tomorrow morning. I'm going to make one more call after this. Are you all right?" I told him I was fine. I wasn't entirely sure if that was true, but I was steady. I've handled financial disasters professionally for over a decade. I know what fraud looks like. I know it always eventually unravels, and I had spent the last 4 hours reading exactly what was on that drive. I slept better than I had any right to. My brother arrived at 9 the next morning with a process server, a real estate attorney, and my mother. My mother was dressed for an occasion. She wore her good cream blazer. She had her pearls on. She looked like a woman arriving at a closing, because in her mind, that's exactly what this was. The process server knocked. I opened the door before his knuckles made contact. I was dressed in a blazer of my own. My grandmother's cardinal mug was in my hand. I had slept 4 hours and I felt completely, entirely calm. "We're here to finalize the property transfer," my brother said. He had a folder under his arm. He was smiling, a performance. The smile said, "This is already done." "You can't be surprised," my sister-in-law added. She already had her phone out, photographing the exterior of the house. My mother stepped forward and put her hand on my arm. Her fingers were cold. "Sweetheart," she said in the voice she uses when she wants something, "this is just a state administration. You've always made things harder than they need to be." I looked at her hand on my arm. I thought about my grandmother's letter, about the word sorry, the only emotional word in the entire thing. My grandmother, who had survived everything and never asked for anything, who kept something this heavy for 2 years to protect me, had apologized to me. I pulled my arm free. "I need you to look across the street," I said. My brother's smile faltered. He looked. My sister-in-law stopped photographing the house. Jerome was standing on his front porch. He was not alone. Behind him and to either side stood 4 individuals, 2 in dark jackets with gold letters across the back that read FBI, 2 in business attire, one of them carrying a hard-sided case I recognized immediately. It's the kind forensic accountants bring to evidence collection appointments. My brother made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Something between a word and a breath that didn't fully become either. "What is this?" my sister-in-law said flatly, not a question. "This is the part where I explain some things," I said. I stepped down onto the porch and looked at all three of them, my brother, his wife, and my mother, who had gone the color of old paper. "Grandma discovered the home equity fraud 22 months ago," I said. "She didn't go straight to the police because she was afraid of what the fallout would do. What she did instead was document everything, every forged signature, every collection notice, every transfer from the HELOC account into your Columbus Shell Company." I looked at my brother. "She gave a copy to Jerome. Jerome gave a copy to his former colleagues at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit 8 months ago. They've been building the case. They were waiting for you to make the next move." My brother's face cycled through several colors. He landed on the specific shade of a man who realizes the floor he has been standing on was glass the entire time. "The will you brought me yesterday was the next move," I continued. "You filed a forged document with the county probate clerk at 4:15 yesterday afternoon. That's a felony. Jerome's colleagues have a copy of the original will. The comparison took about 40 minutes. "Don't say anything," my sister-in-law said, sharp and low, grabbing his arm, "not a single word." The process server had been standing slightly behind them the whole time. He looked between the FBI agents crossing the street and the folder in his hand, quietly set the folder on the porch railing, and took 3 large steps toward the sidewalk. Jerome walked across the street slowly, the way people walk when they're not in any hurry, because the situation is already handled. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked at my brother with an expression that wasn't anger or triumph. It was something closer to the absence of surprise. "Your grandmother was a good woman," Jerome said. "She deserved a great deal better than what you gave her." My brother's mouth opened, his wife tightened her grip on his arm. The lead FBI agent stepped forward with her badge. "I won't describe the arrest itself in detail. I'll tell you that my sister-in-law kept repeating, 'I want my attorney,' and my brother stopped speaking entirely, which was probably the smartest decision he'd made in years. I'll tell you that the Range Rover they'd arrived in was photographed and noted as a potentially fraudulent asset, and I'll tell you that my mother didn't intervene. She stood on the porch steps and watched her son being handcuffed without making a sound. When the car doors closed, she turned to me. The pearls, the cream blazer, the practiced expression of maternal concern that she switched on like a lamp when the audience shifted. "I didn't know any of this," she said. "I thought he'd just asked her to update the paperwork. I thought it was routine. I had no idea about the loan." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when she'd told me in the kitchen while I did the dishes that I needed to be more generous with your brother because he's going through a hard time. I thought about every time she had looked at Jerome at a family gathering and somehow found somewhere else to be looking. "Mom," I said, "I found the text messages." She went very still. "On the USB drive, there was a screenshot of a conversation between you and my brother from 18 months ago. He told you about the HELOC. You told him to be careful." I paused. "You used the word cleanup when talking about what he'd need to do if Grandma ever found out. The FBI has the drive." My mother took a step back. Her heel caught the edge of the porch step and she grabbed the railing. "I was trying to protect this family," she said. What was underneath her voice now was harder and much less familiar. "No," I said, "you were protecting his access to her money and yours." I went inside and locked the door. The toxicology review was requested 3 weeks later by my grandmother's physician, who found her symptom log and medication notes, preserved on the USB drive in meticulous detail, compelling enough to flag. The review findings showed that her blood pressure dosage had been altered in the last 2 months of her life, not dramatically, just enough to affect a 79-year-old heart under sustained stress over time. The prescription change was traced to a pharmacy recently acquired by a small holding company with one beneficial owner listed in the Articles of Incorporation. My brother's name. I will not tell you I didn't cry when I found out. I will tell you that I cried once, alone in my grandmother's kitchen with her cardinal mug between my hands. And then I called Jerome and gave him the contact information for the pharmaceutical toxicologist my firm had used on a prior case, and then I went back to work. The arraignment was 4 weeks after the arrest. My brother and sister-in-law faced charges that included wire fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, financial elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder in the second degree. Bail was set at a level they could not meet, partly because every account tied to their names had been frozen pending the fraud recovery proceedings. My mother was charged separately as a financial co-conspirator. She hired her own attorney and began cooperating with the prosecution almost immediately, describing my brother's conduct in terms that suited her own interests and nobody else's. I was not in the courtroom for most of it. I had work to do. There is a commercial property in Columbus, a mixed-use building, retail on the ground floor, 2 floors of office space above. My grandmother had purchased it in 1991 and owned it outright for more than a decade. My brother hadn't known it existed because she had kept it in a separate trust with a property management company handling operations. It generated income. She used to live quietly and put birthday checks in card envelopes with stamps she bought at the post office, not online. The commercial property and this house both passed to me under the original will. The first thing I did to the house was repair the front porch board that had been soft for 2 years. My grandmother had just been careful about where she stepped. I hired a local contractor. I painted the exterior the same green it had been when I was a child. I reinstalled the ceramic frog by the front door. Jerome came to dinner the first night I officially moved in. He brought a bottle of wine he'd been saving for something worth marking. We sat in my grandmother's kitchen and didn't talk about the case. We talked about her, about the road trips she'd taken in her 60s, about her opinion of instant coffee versus the real thing, about the summer she decided to refinish every piece of furniture in the house and did it in 3 months flat. Jerome told me she had given him the lockbox key to hold for 4 months before she felt comfortable with the hiding place being on the property itself. He told me she had been very specific about what to do when the call came. He told me she had not been afraid. I believed that. I believe it because I knew her, and I knew how she moved through the world quietly, steadily, without making unnecessary noise. The cardinal doesn't have to be loud to be beautiful. I started the Ruth Adeline Greer Opportunity Grant in her name the following year. It funds forensic accounting certifications for women leaving financially abusive situations, women who need to know how to follow money, trace fraud, and understand precisely what was done to them. The commercial property generates the income. The first round of grants went out in September. On the morning the disbursements were confirmed, I got a call from a blocked number. It was my mother calling from someone else's phone because her service had been cut off. She said she was staying at a motel outside Dayton. She said the condo was gone. She said my brother was in federal prison and his wife had filed for divorce to limit her own liability and that she was alone. I listened until she finished. I keep Grandma's cardinal mug on the kitchen counter, I told her. Every morning I use it. Every morning I think about the fact that she spent her last 2 years afraid and alone, documenting her own son's crimes in a spiral notebook in a root cellar, because she didn't want to blow up the family. My mother started to say something. You told him to be careful, I said, not to stop, careful. I ended the call. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter beside the mug with the faded cardinal on it. Outside the bay window, the yard was doing what it does in October in Ohio, going gold and orange at the edges, the maple dropping leaves in slow arcs across the lawn she raked every year without complaint. I poured my coffee. I went to work. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you, right up until the moment it costs them everything, leave a comment below. I read every single one.